ever noticed how different the world used to feel when the night was completely disconnected? I'm thinking back to the summer of '96. It's strange how certain dates just anchor themselves in your mind, refusing to drift away with the rest of the clutter. I was driving an old sedan back then, the kind with the heavy velour seats that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old upholstery foam. No cellular phones, no digital maps glowing on the dashboard, just a creased paper atlas jammed into the glove compartment and whatever local AM radio station managed to cut through the mountain static. It was well past 2 in the morning on Route 9. If you've never been out there, it's just miles of dense pine trees pressing right up against the gravel shoulders. The asphalt was slick from a midnight shower that had just tapered off into a heavy, hanging mist. Every time the tires rolled over the painted white lines, there was this rhythmic, hypnotic sound. Thump, 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 thump. It becomes sort of a second heartbeat when you're the only person awake for 50 miles. The dashboard lights were a pale, faded green. They barely illuminated the cabin, just casting enough light to see the dust motes dancing across the plastic instrument cluster. I remember adjusting the volume knob on the radio, trying to find a signal. Instead of music, there was just this low, rhythmic pulse of static. It sounded almost like waves crashing on a distant shore, or maybe a crowded room, whispering all at once from a long way off. It was comforting, in a lonely sort of way. And then, the headlights caught something up ahead. You know how the fog can play tricks on your eyes when you've been staring at the white lines for 3 hours straight. The mind wants to build shapes out of nothing. It turns branches into people and shadows into obstacles. But this wasn't a trick of the light. About 50 yards away, standing right beneath a rusted metal mile marker, was a person. They were completely still. They weren't waving their arms or flashing a flashlight. They just stood there, their boots right on the edge where the gravel met the weeds. They wore a heavy, oversized canvas coat. The fabric looked dark, soaked through by the recent rain, clinging heavily to their frame. A wide-brimmed hat hid their face entirely, tilting downward toward the wet asphalt. As the car pulled closer, my foot naturally hovered over the brake pedal. In the '90s, picking up a traveler wasn't entirely uncommon, especially out on those rural state routes where gas stations closed at sundown. You felt a certain unspoken obligation to the shared isolation of the road. But there was a strange gravity to the way this person stood. They hadn't raised a thumb. Their hands were shoved deep into their coat pockets. They didn't even lift their chin as my headlights washed over them, turning the yellow canvas of their jacket into a brilliant, stark gold against the black forest behind them. The closer the sedan crept, the more the silence inside the car seemed to expand. The radio static suddenly smoothed out, dropping into a dead, hollow The only sound left was the low, mechanical ticking of my own engine. I slowed down to a crawl. The headlights were fully illuminating them now. I could see the individual droplets of water dripping from the brim of that hat, falling in slow motion onto the shoulder of their coat. My hand reached for the window crank. I was going to roll the glass down, just a fraction of an inch, to ask if they needed a ride to the next town. My fingers wrapped around the cold plastic handle. And then, right as the front bumper aligned with their silhouette, I stopped. A sudden, cold realization washed over me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you step too close to the edge of a very high cliff. A sudden awareness of a massive, quiet space opening up right in front of you. I realized that despite the heavy rain that had just drenched the entire valley, the ground directly beneath this person's boots was completely dry. There were no puddles around their feet. The gravel looked powdery and gray, untouched by the moisture that had slicked the rest of the highway. And their shadow, the car's headlights were throwing a long, dark shape behind them, stretching deep into the pine trees. But as the sedan crept forward, changing the angle of the light, the shadow didn't move. It stayed fixed, pointing straight ahead into the woods, completely independent of the car's headlights. I didn't roll down the window. My hand let go of the crank. Instead, my foot pressed down on the accelerator, not in panic, but with a firm, deliberate pressure. The engine groaned, the transmission shifted, and the old sedan began to pull away, leaving the mile marker behind. I looked up at the rearview mirror. Because the car was moving forward, the red glow of my taillights washed over the figure from behind. In that crimson light, they finally moved. They didn't chase the car. They didn't look angry. They simply turned their head, very slowly, to watch the sedan retreat. Under the brim of that hat, where a face should have been, there was just emptiness, a smooth, reflective surface that caught the red brake lights like a mirror reflecting a distant fire. They lifted one hand out of their pocket, not to wave goodbye, but to point. And they were pointing directly at the passenger seat, right next to me. And I looked down at the empty seat beside me. The velour fabric was completely untouched, of course, but the pale green light from the dashboard was reflecting off something on the floor mat. A small, wet puddle was slowly forming in the footwell. A steady, silent drip of water was falling from the edge of the passenger seat, soaking into the carpet, smelling faintly of old pennies and river mud. I didn't stop the car until the sun came up over the state line. I never found out who or what was standing by that mile marker, and I never drove down Route 9 again. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I still look down at that empty passenger seat, just making sure the fabric is completely dry. The 90s were a different time. We left so many questions unanswered because we didn't have the tools to look them up. We just carried them with us. letting them turn into folklore in the quiet corners of our minds. It makes you think about the paths we choose to take and the ones we decide to pass by, the people we leave standing on the shoulder of the road, and the pieces of them that somehow manage to slip inside the car anyway, riding along with us in the silence. The night is so long when you're moving through it alone, but you aren't truly alone, are you? The memory of every place you've ever been is just resting in the back seat, waiting for the light to fade. Tell me, if you could go back to that rainy stretch of highway, knowing what you know now, would you have rolled down the window?